morning. I'm Mary Michele, and I have here with me today the Reverend Flagg. He's a Zen priest, and we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about astrology and Zen.
Good morning. Good morning.
How are you?
I'm well, and I'm happy to be here.
Well, good. We're happy to have you. We wanted to ask you a little bit about astrology and how that fits in with Zen, and if there is any kind of correlation, if there is some
Okay. How they correlate and whether or not Zen has anything to say about that.
Right.
Well, I can't really speak entirely for all Zen Buddhists. So but the first thing though I think that I would like to consider is what one really thinks about what astrology is. Is it rational? Is it irrational? What is it? Because I think that most people in the scientific community or more rational community believe that people that are involved in something like astrology they're sort of lacking in understanding of what's really happening, and we're always trying to
perhaps they're a little superstitious.
Perhaps a little superstitious,
right.
Yes, or perhaps they're trying to use rationality to suppress their superstitions. So I think generally these days, instead of people willing to admit that they do have these irrational feelings about things, they're more likely to suppress them in some way. For instance, and so in Zen we say that repression creates anxiety. So, for instance, you have Friday the 13th comes along, and you have to go for a airplane ride, say to San Diego or to Europe or something like this. And what ends up happening is that
this is interesting because in astrology we deal a lot with the moon, and Friday the 13th, perhaps one of the feelings of superstition regarding that is because astrology was something that was banned by the church at one time, and I think there's always been somewhat of an interest in it, but it's because it has this fate-free will problem, and throughout the year, throughout our solar year, our 365 days, there are 13 lunar months, 13 full moons. So anyway, going back to this Friday the 13th.
Okay, so the Friday the 13th, as everybody says, don't walk under ladders, throw the salt over your left shoulder, do this, don't do this. For the superstitious person, so-called superstitious person, they would, of course, have these subscribed things that they do, sort of rituals that they go through, where the rational person will get on the plane and say, we'll kind of poo-poo that experience, get on the plane, fly to San Diego, but in the mid-flight they start having an anxiety attack. And so for some unknown reason, probably what one would think is that the unknown reason could be sort of medically proven, but so we have on one aspect we have the person that's irrational and kind of stupid and has stupid superstitions, and then the other aspect we have the person that has the anxiety attack, but at least he's not being put in the class of superstitious and so on. But my question would be is, do you think, which one would you think that lacks the intelligence? Which of course is neither one, right? It would be that the person that has the intelligence to realize that they have irrational thoughts and are able to deal with them in acceptable ways to themselves would have a better, would be better to deal with their anxieties.
I think this concept of what is rational and what is irrational is something that is a question that perplexes most of us all of the time. It's a difficult thing to try to completely understand. So we tend to go to one extreme or the other, whereas I think that the best way is to probably observe the fact when you're being a little bit too concrete, or when you're being a little too out there, when you're not making any sense at all. know, which is what the irrational part would be. So to move on a little bit, should we go on about what is the nature of tolerance and intolerance?
Yeah, and also, what superstition is. I mean, I think we should leave. I think you're right. Let's leave that for a minute. And tolerance is something that I think that should come up when we are starting to think about things like astrology or holistic healing or elements of ways of understanding our universe, how we live in this life. Because I think now we're finding that acupuncture is something that's being accepted by the medical
and by insurance companies. I was reading where Mutual of Omaha is allowing now for certain alternative therapies, discovering that in actuality it's much less expensive for them to do that.
Yeah, and so we have these things from the past, which is, what is it, the drum beaters and the rattle shakers, of the shamans, but somehow they are able to have more success than these very radical procedures of surgery where you take, a knife to your body and have these things happening. It's very, very difficult things, and so either one seems, to the mind, both rather irrational. And so what we have to begin then is talk about, firstly, we have to talk about intellectual intolerance to non-rational beliefs. Generally, the person that is the most irresolute and can't make any clear distinction about intolerance or tolerance themselves is the person that says, okay, well, I'm going to choose to be intolerant to people that use holistic health, and they begin to think of themselves as being very, very rational. I'm going to have a very rational explanation why it is that I'm doing something. And perhaps you can think of an example. For instance, but generally what happens is they repress the irrational feelings, and then they kind of pat themselves on the back for being rational. A case in point would be is a friend of mine who is a physicist said that he was just very surprised that the youth these days are using something like astrology to have their chart. A composite of a chart. You know something about this. Composite charts and how you can
for a relationship, like a marriage or something like that. Yes.
Yeah, it would be for a marriage. Mm-hmm. And how what they do is they get a marriage. What would it be called? It would be called a marriage reading, right?
Right.
And what they have is that it comes up in the say the chart says, well, I'm going to have. A wonderful marriage, a wonderful so on and so on. I don't know what you would say to something like this, but and
harmonious aspects or aspects that are more difficult.
Okay,
yes.
Yeah,
right.
And but suddenly they begin to feel sort of blessed that their life will be much better. By using this chart. In other words, my question would be to these rationalists that someone that always uses rationale, scientific method of cause and effect, and that any statistical data, is there any statistical data to show that marriage is based on astrological considerations are any less or more successful than those based on rational conclusions? I mean, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, Carl Jung wrote a book on what is called synchronicity, and he, in the book, has a series of tables that he made up of different examples of people that got married and where were the different planets in each other's chart mutually. And the one aspect that was the most overriding, that came up the most often, was a sun-moon conjunction, usually with the man's sun and the woman's moon being in the same sign, same degree, that so on. Because what that is really is the moon, the feminine, the unconscious, supporting the male solar principle. And, as a rule, these kind of things really do work, although I know at times one fights against it, and says, oh, well, why can't it be me that's the solar principle? Or, the man might want to be more, introverted and might want to spend time at home. But this is something that has come up as a survey. But the nature of astrology is that it tries to not put too much belief in the idea of surveys, because we come back to the idea of cause and effect again and how valid it is.
Well, yeah, because I think that, how I understand astrology is that even though it gives you, say, I would surmise that the two people who have a favorable horoscope probably will have a favorable marriage and will be happy and so on, but they still have to do their work.
Exactly.
They still have to work on the issues that come up, the sort of do's and don'ts, the toothbrush and all of that, those issues. I mean, the horoscope probably has nothing to say about that.
No, it will point out the way that you might react to it, which, with certain hard aspects, it might be, more conflicting, yeah.
But initially, I mean, I would surmise to say that people that have astrological beliefs, that this would be, favorable for them, would be quite self-fulfilling. Mm-hmm. So my friend, though, what he did is he sort of concluded by saying that, yes, right, sure, I can understand that, because but we still shouldn't be too tolerant. And this is the thing that was very irksome, because I feel that tolerance is something that we're going to need more of as this world gets bigger and people are having to communicate even more. I mean, the computer as such, with the World Wide Web and everything, is making all of us communicate more and more instead of less and less. And so we have to now become more tolerant instead of less tolerant. So this astrology is perhaps a way in which we can find tolerance between us rather than intolerance, because we've got, I don't know, what would you say about that?
Well, I think the images and the symbolism that one uses in astrology will allow you to look at the other person's point of view in conjunction with your own in a different way than you might have before. So it will give you the symbols and the imagery and the concepts. Astrology will give you the ideas. It's just a way of boosting the imagination, giving it a little bit of a something that's enlightening, if you would, inspirational, but a new way of looking at things, or a different way of looking at things. Astrology is old, but the concepts of ideas are always, it's trying to help new ideas always, and how do you come about new ideas? So this idea of tolerance and intolerance, and I think what the Reverend Flagg is saying is that it's coming to a point where we have to find different ways of looking at things, because there's so many different factors that we're dealing with now. The world's becoming too small.
Yeah, I think, or it's, at least it's becoming more village-like instead of more world-like. Right. I wanted to voice, also, with you in concurrence with that in intelligence, in talking about intolerance about it's the so-called, divination, because largely, and maybe unfortunately, astrologers are kind of put in a difficult position, or even precarious position, of having to do divinations, tell about the future. And my view about astrology, and this is my humble opinion, is that, or maybe not so humble opinion, is that the astrology is something that yields one to be more communicative between each other instead of less. So you can't really prove a point. I wouldn't go to prove a point about the future with astrology, but what I would look to in astrology is how things come together, so that we can look at things more holistically rather than compartmentally. So it's from a standpoint then of not being intolerant to intolerance, but tolerant to intolerance. And I know I've used those words a lot, but that's what I think. So I'm less tolerant of intolerant attitudes towards astrology than I am of astrology itself. So they have about.
And I think the idea of my understanding of Zen, and the Reverend Flagg will say if I'm saying it wrong, but the idea is that the first concept that we got in this country on a mass scale was Zen and the art of archery, and very much like what I talked about the other day. When I look at a chart, you take in all the facts, you take in all the disciplines, you try to really get yourself as structured as you possibly can, and then the nature of Zen, as my understanding of it in this book, was that you then aimed for the bullseye, and you had to trust that the arrow would get there. So there is something that I think is universal in concept about that theory. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, if I'm understanding you, is that we have our particular goal, and then we have our standpoint about how we're going to reach that goal. And when we, there is our intention, that we're going to hit the target with this arrow, and then we pull the arrow against the string, and then the arrow somehow falls into the target. Or the target, or conversely, the target falls into the arrow.
Right.
Right, so both have to kind of converge into a shared experience instead of me, say, meeting with you or you meeting with me. Suddenly, what we do is the boundaries become very fuzzy, and we begin to have a shared experience of communication that goes beyond just a simple exchange of words.
So now, would you call this synchronicity or cause and effect?
Well, astrology, I think, alludes to something very similar to this Carl Jung's idea of what a synchronicity, what he would call synchronicity, and this concept of synchronicity is a rather difficult concept to explain, or a difficult concept to understand, but especially to minds that are well steeped into cause and effect relationships between one thing happens and another thing is moved by that. Synchronicity, though not incompatible with causality, shows us something different about two events or events that are perceived. The idea of synchronicity of two events is not one is the cause of the other, right? But they have a common cause, or they have a parallel events, right? So if one applies then synchronicity to astrology, or at least how I look at astrology, for example, the correlation between the astronomical configuration, say the stars, right, causing people's behaviors to happen. At the time someone's birth, the characteristics of the person, then it is not the planets really that are causing someone to behave in such a way, but rather it is the person's circumstances. It's the circumstances, the sort of the combined effect of all of the circumstances that come together to give rise to the individual's particular behaviors, so to speak. So it's not that the stars are a cause of one's behavior, but the stars and the person come together to make sorry about that, I just do things with my hands, but they come together to make a circumstance, and a circumstance is such that we have a individual or particular person in time. So is that kind of, I mean, that's how I understand it. Is that sort of come together with the astrological idea of what synchronicity is?
I believe it does. I think that synchronicity is something that is being used a lot with astrology. It's also used with psychotherapy. And the idea is to try to explain or understand certain effects that may cause your mood to change. And going back to the idea of superstition, what is the difference between being superstitious and worried about getting on that plane and paranoia? And I think that it's a difficult call to know exactly when it is that you've gone beyond the bounds of paranoia and you've gone into something that is...
Well, there's a well-known story that used to circulate in the monastery that I trained in. The Zen master one day was deeply involved in garden work, meditating deeply about the meanings of flowers and the breeze and everything. And he was particularly sensitive to anything that was around him. His meditation had advanced in such a way that he was able to sort of feel various circumstances around him. And suddenly he felt that he was in the midst of imminent danger. And so he looked around, and all he saw was this innocent little boy. And he was very, very disturbed about that because he couldn't figure out why he felt one way and yet something else was happening, Something else was happening. It was just that, he felt endangered, but in another way, there was just a small boy there. So there's this sense of paranoia. He felt, oh my gosh, I'm falling rise to deluded thinking or paranoia, and so he thought, well, time for a fast, So he stopped eating. He stopped, any interaction with anybody, and pretty much locked himself in his cell. And as the days went on, the information sort of circulated, and do we have time? It's almost time.
Yes, no.
What happened was finally the acolyte that was in the back, and it was that was in back of him, came forward and said, kind of in fear for his own being expelled from the monastery, said, well, I was thinking when I was behind you that even though you're a very strong and powerful Zen master, at this moment you're in an enormously vulnerable aspect, and I could just pop you off with a rock. And I'm sorry. And it was not in the Zen.
So the priest heard him.
So he sort of felt
him.
this circumstance.
So he wasn't paranoid.
So he wasn't paranoid, but nor was he doing anything called mental telepathy.
Right.
There was just this actually this example of two parallel events happening to create a particular sense. Everybody's got this feeling that that they have, it sounds right or it feels right. This is sort of an empirical way in which one can begin to get at the understanding of synchronicity. So astrology is something that points to that and helps with that. So.
Well, I think this is a pretty cohesive, comprehensive explanation of the nature of a very difficult subject.
Well, and astrology as well as synchronicity, and so both I think are compatible, and it's compatible to a kind of a more tolerant and expansive way of thinking, rather than just simple cause and effect relationships that we have in life. So it can be quite helpful, but as I say again, you have to do your own work.
Yes, I agree with you, and I think it's wonderful that you stated and reinforced my beliefs, and hopefully the people out there as well will take this to heart, that it's something that you have to keep working for yourself, so you have your own free will.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we'll be back with Mary Michele, taking your calls at 241-1310 right after these words. Professional sports care where you don't have to be an athlete to be treated like one. High school and recreational athletes, corporate employees, industrial workers, and weekend warriors, you can now all take advantage of professional sports care facilities and their expertise. Pioneered by the medical staff of the New York Football Giants, Professional Sports Care is the largest network of rehab centers in the tri-state area. They provide comprehensive physical, occupational, and rehabilitative services for all orthopedic and sports-related injuries. At Professional Sports Care in Mount Kisco, they work with every patient in a hands-on, proactive, safe, and a very functional environment. Each patient receiving an individualized program that expresses the expertise of the staff, the needs and goals of the patient to facilitate full recovery to the pre-injury level of function. And with the emphasis on today's active lifestyle, no matter what age you are, there does come the increased risk of injuries. If you're injured, call Professional Sports Care or visit one of their convenient northern Westchester locations. If you're a commuter and have trouble scheduling, you can tap into their extensive network for all your therapy needs. And remember, at Professional Sports Care, you don't have to be an athlete to be treated like one. Call Professional Sports Care today, 241-0106, or stop by at 40-02 Radio Circle, Mount Kisco. And, of course, we'll have a live remote tomorrow from 2 to 5 right here at 1310 WVIP Mount Kisco. We will be over at Professional Sports Care. Lori Blanchard there, along with yours truly, Mike Sornoff. We will be back with Mary Michele taking your phone calls on astrology at 241-1310. If you'd like to get a quick reading, number to call 241-1310. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
Harry, this is going to be some billboard.
Yeah, I think the Bowlerama people are going to be very pleased.
So, can I let go of this cable now?
You kidding? That cable you're holding is the only thing keeping me and this 30-foot bowling ball I'm sitting on from falling off this platform, squashing all those parked cars and landing in the duck pond.
Oh.
What's that?
The New York State Lotto jackpot is now $15 million.
Harry, can I let go of the cable now? I want to go get a lotto ticket.
No.
That's $15 million.
Harry, I'm letting go of the cable now.
Man, I've got to get out advertising.
New York Lotto. Hey, you never know.
Bonus days are back. Next week, all New York numbers payouts will be at least 20% bigger on all play types, straight, box, and combination. So play the New York Lottery numbers game. Every day's a play day, but only next week has bonus days.
And again, if you would like to talk to Mary Michele, number to call is 241-1310. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Meet the VIPs, and our guest is Mary Michele, who is an astrologer. And I got a question for you just listening to what the Reverend was talking about. Are there certain people with certain signs who have the ability for ESP more than others? I mean, he was talking about the Zen master who felt something, but he wasn't paranoid. Somebody would... Are there groups that go through this?
There are two ways of looking at this. You could either, yes, I would say that there are indications in the astrological chart. Certainly the planet Neptune or the sign Pisces would be the two strongest indicators that the person would have the ability to have some kind of trust in their psychic ability. Of course, I think someone like the Reverend Flagg or someone that does a lot of meditation or of the like, this kind of person is more in touch with their inner self. So they may have not had any of these aspects in their chart, but they've worked very, very hard at trying to develop their understanding and insight into human nature. So how they would exactly, what the concrete answer would be, it could be partially as astrological and partially the work that one does for oneself, on oneself.
Are there certain people who are able... you see these things on television, person in a different room, and they're picking up these vibes, who may be Pisces or the Neptune being there. Are there people who can transmit better than other people?
Again, yes, I think there's no question. I mean, some people are born with this facility, and I think that there's throughout history there's been a certain amount of fear attached. The person that has this kind of ability is fearful of what they might see. So this is where the training of really acknowledging and doing work on yourself will allow you to feel better about the fact that this is not necessarily you were given this gift for some purpose that's perhaps not to your understanding liking or to your, you feel totally comfortable with. But hey, some people can't lose weight and some people can't gain it. There's always going to be something that's difficult in terms of how you are comfortable in your own skin.
Okay, we have a caller now. Diane is on line 1. Her date of birth is December 19th, 1929. December 19th, 1929. Good morning, Diane.
Good morning.
Where are you calling from?
Mount Kisco.
Mount Kisco, okay. And Mary Michele, you're on the air with Diane.
Okay, December 19th, 1929. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, is there a particular question that you had?
No, just I'm watching you on television.
Okay.
Now you can wave at her. There we go. See?
Okay. So you have the moon in Leo. Today I wanted to talk a little bit, in as much as it's Friday, I wanted to talk about the planet Venus.